Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Halperin. I'm executive editor of Artnet News in New York, and I'm here with Rachel Corbett.
Hi, Rachel Corbett. I'm deputy editor at Artnet News, also in New York. Julia and I work together, obviously, and we're going to talk about some issues pertaining to women in the art world, which is based on a larger reporting project that Julia spearheaded at Artnet last year. And maybe you can talk about more about that.
Sure. So this was a project that we did in collaboration with Charlotte Burns at In Other Words, where we looked at the collecting and exhibiting practices of museums in the US and also looked at the market to get a sense of, how the representation of women had shifted in museums in the art market over the last decade. And it was the sort of second collaboration that we have done together, which the sort of desire started out of this idea that there was a lot of conversation and sort of trend stories in the press about progress towards representation, both with respect to Black artists and also with respect to women. And there were a lot of kind of, flashy initiatives and just sort of like self-congratulatory talk. And we wondered, first, was it possible to quantify the kind of progress that people were talking about? And if we did that, what would we find? Would it be as much progress as people assumed? And so the first collaboration we did was looking at African-American artists, and this was the second, which was looking at women. And in both cases, we found a similar kind of proportionate lack of representation. We found that the representation of African-American artists and women was about a fifth of what it should be if you believe that museum collections should be a reflection of the distribution of the population. So with respect to women, we found that over the previous 10 years, 11% of all acquisitions museums, these 26 US museums made, were of work by women. And maybe even more striking than that was the fact that there had actually been no discernible progress over that time, that the numbers peaked in 2009 and either stayed flat or got worse. So basically, our assumption that we had just been getting better and better was just totally wrong. And, it was an interesting thing to look in parallel with the art market, where we used Artnet auction data to track sales of art by women at auction, and found that in total, over that same period, they represented about 2% of all auction sales, which is crazy when you think that women represent half the population. But we did see more progress there. So, the total sales had doubled over that 10-year period. So you did see an incline, whereas you didn't with acquisitions. And so, part of the reporting process then was talking to people to kind of understand those numbers and put them in context and figure out why we were seeing what we were seeing. So that's kind of the bird's eye view of the project. And in addition to interviewing, artists, museum people, gallerists, auction house people, to kind of figure out some of the different causes, which I think we'll get into. We also wanted to zero in on particular issues, one of which is maternity leave. And that was what Rachel covered. So Rachel, I wonder if you could talk about sort of what made you interested in pursuing this and what you found.
Yeah, well, I think the impetus for this this story that I wrote in this research was probably largely the lawsuit that Nikki Columbus, a curator, filed in 2018 against MoMA PS1 here in New York. It was kind of an unusual case because it was not strictly pregnancy discrimination or gender discrimination, though she does allege that, but it was a caregiver discrimination case, which was just something I hadn't ever thought of myself. It's not something we hear about a lot, in the art world or really any parts of the world. It's kind of a tricky legal position that caregivers occupy. In the U.S., we have laws against, like I said, pregnancy discrimination, but many states don't have it against caregivers. So New York does, but like California doesn't, for example. So in this lawsuit, what happened was Nikki Columbus was offered a job at MoMA PS1, and then over the course of the negotiations of her salary and start dates, and whether she'd asked at one point if she could work part-time and from home, and because she'd recently given birth. And then shortly thereafter, the museum said that she had declined the job offer and it was no longer active. And she claims that she did not decline the job offer. They were just negotiating the details. So she sued them because she felt that they rescinded the offer because she had revealed that she'd had a baby at home, and that this would make her less. They assumed this would make her less available. Ultimately, they settled. So we don't know how this would have played out. But part of the settlement was that PS1 would have to revise its anti-discrimination policy to include caregiver protections for job applicants as well as employees. So
I wonder if you can just explain quickly for people who don't know, including sort of me, what is the difference between a pregnancy discrimination case and a caregiver discrimination case?
Yeah, so a pregnancy is someone who's actively pregnant. You can't fire someone for being pregnant, for example. A caregiver would be someone who already has a child at home. So in this case, she just had a baby, and says that she doesn't think they knew that she was ever pregnant. So it wasn't that; it was that she just had a baby, and that they assumed that she assumes that they assumed that this would make her less available for the job. So that's the caregiver. But it could also be people with other children at home of all ages, that kind of thing, which of course disproportionately often falls on women to do the caregiving work.
And in your research, I'm curious about what you found in terms of connections between the sort of themes of that case and the other people you talked to. Like, were there kind of tensions and sort of structural issues presented in that case that you found elsewhere among other people who work in other parts of the art world?
Yeah, well, I think one of the biggest common themes throughout is that from the women I spoke to is that it's really an invisible problem. It's not something that, maternity leave is something we hear about. We know there are policies in place, but that there are a lot of other issues surrounding parenthood, childbirth, breastfeeding, a lot of things that are not black and white, particularly in the art industry where a lot of times we're working with small businesses or independent contractors and freelancers and artists who don't have protections under the law. It's just not clearly defined. And in the case of this lawsuit, there wasn't a policy on the books apparently for whether a job applicant had protections as a caregiver. This is just sort of new territory. And that's, I think, where a lot of the people I spoke with were, I was really overwhelmed by the amount, oh, no one ever talks about this in the media, or no one ever talks about this. And it's a thing that mothers, a lot of complaints that they have with each other and they share in their communities, but that were not talked about in the greater art world. Yes.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. I mean, when I was reading your piece, I had never read or really even thought about the complexities of pumping in the workplace, and specifically in a museum where so often the kind of outward facing spaces are the best well kept, and often museum office spaces are nowhere near as fancy as you think from walking through the museum. And so, space is really at a premium, especially in cities. And so having the proper space and the timing and, one of the other things I thought was so interesting was just the idea that the kind of the job of working in the art world in so many different ways makes parenthood challenging. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the job in the art world is, a lot of it is seeing and being seen, and going to parties and going to art fairs and going out at night to dinners and all of these things that can be very challenging if you have a child at home, if you're pregnant. And the pumping issue is I'm not a parent myself either. So I had never considered this, but I was totally amazed at how this was like the number one thing that people talked about. This is the where to do it, when to do it. It's like you said, it's not mandated in a lot of states that you have a designated area in your workplace. In New York now it is, but most states it's not. So you have women going into broom closets and shared bathrooms and like trying to sneak away throughout the day. And I had one woman from a gallery kind of really put it into stark terms for me when she talked about trying to go to Art Basel, calling the convention center to ask where she could do it. And then, none of the staff having any idea, and then getting there and trying to steal off from her booth for like 20 minutes and then rushing to like a dinner meeting, and then rushing with like, holding like canisters of breast milk and keeping it cold. And I mean, it's just, when you think, you don't think about these things and you don't have to do it. But it's definitely apparently a very big problem. And yeah, like you were saying, just that the industry itself is very social, and there are a lot of the businesses, don't have clear HR departments. Say galleries don't have HR departments to to make all of these policies. So they're kind of winging it as they go. The first staffer gets pregnant and then they're like, okay, well, let's come up with the policy. And it's often, falls on that person to navigate that terrain anew. So it's definitely tricky. And another thing that a lot of people talked about was the issue of, when you're a freelancer, not having benefits or health insurance. If you're an artist, there's also a feeling of isolation is something that I heard talked about for a lot of new parents in this business. They're isolated from the social aspects of the field, from their communities, and they don't have caregivers of their own a lot of times if they don't have benefits or insurance. So many of the artists did their own caregiving. And Catherine Opie, one of the artists that we spoke to, really talked about the gender disparity in this aspect, where she saw a lot of men going out while the women were the male artists were going out, while the female artists were staying home, and she herself was often finding herself in that position. So she created a sort of policy at her own studio for assistants, so that they can bring their kids to the work, and there's sort of a play area cornered off in her studio. That's why, there's just creative solutions being kind of determined on the fly in this field.
Well, and it made me wonder too, I mean, this isn't something that you address directly in the piece, but I wondered if having a female boss, or having a boss who's also a mother, makes a difference. Like if these people are more likely to have policies in advance, or to have considered it in advance, whereas maybe if you're a male art dealer or a male artist running a studio, it doesn't occur to you until the first employee you have gets pregnant?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I suspect that's the case, because it does seem like a lot of these businesses are just doing it as it comes up. And, or if you're the owner of an art gallery, say a woman owner of an art gallery, then, you have to just do all of it. You don't get any, there's really no time off unless you want to shut your business for a while, so that falls on you. Yeah. And I think male art, or male, if they're not forced to think about these things, people tend not to, I think, in most areas. So that's really the crux of it. And I think that this piece was just sort of a first step in at least just exposing some of these issues, I hope, and bringing them to light. I don't think a lot of them have been talked about at all. And in terms of, we haven't quite gotten to a place yet where there's, where I've heard a lot of, there's legal challenges or new policies being instituted yet. I think it's just in these early stages of people starting to talk about. I think I've gotten more emails on this story than any story.
I was going to ask about that, about what kind of reaction you got from people.
Yeah, I mean, it was overwhelming, and I just think people were so happy to see these very private, grievances and problems find a light of day. And, I had no idea it was such a sort of simmering issue. So we'll see what, where things go in the future. I don't know, should we pivot to?
Sure, yeah.
I feel like there's a lot to talk about with your project because there's several stories and a lot of data that goes with it. So I think let's maybe start with the museum's question, the big piece. I guess let's start with, I'm curious to know why the assumption exists, because I think I shared it, that there has been so much change. Is it just because of the media, and there's just been, feminism has reached a level of in the public discourse that we just assume change is following suit, do you think?
Yeah, I think, some of it is the kind of the flawed idea that like one very visible thing means that there's fundamental change. Like, you'll see one major show of like a Cindy Sherman retrospective at MoMA, or, the Hilma Afklint show at the Guggenheim, which is wildly successful. And you sort of think, well, like, that's really popular, so everything must be changing, which is just sort of like a flaw of human logic, I think, in so many ways, and doesn't just apply to this. And I also think that it is true that there was a lot of press, and like I think we were guilty of it too, of drawing a line between a few things and feeling like there was some massive change. We were looking at older articles when we started, and it was all, there were like things from the New York Times that were from 2018 or 2019 that was like the year of the women at museums, and of course, that isn't true if you look at the data, and I think that also, museums are promoting themselves when they have these projects. Like, you're never going to see a museum put out a press release that's like, all of our spring shows are men. But they would do that and they have done that for a program that's all women. And so I think that is a big reason why you have a disproportionate and sort of misrepresentative sense of what's happening.
Yeah, like the Baltimore Museum we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, but the Baltimore Museum, they got tons of press for announcing that they were going to dedicate their full 2020 program to work by women. And then we were just talking about how, they're going to be closed for much of 2020. So it's TBD what kind of impact that's going to have. And I will say too that, they had also said that they would only acquire work by women during that year. But then later sort of confirmed that didn't include gifts.
Oh,
so, and our research shows that, that gifts make up well over half of acquisitions at museums. So it's like, when you really look at the fine print, I think and it's a conversation that we're having about equity with respect to race too, that the kind of narrative is one thing, and then the actions are another. And often, people who are doing really serious work internally, may not be promoting it that way.
Yeah. So what are the, I don't know if you have it on hand, but maybe you can tell generally too, what are some of the exhibition figures, what,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we should talk about acquisition figures too, but.
Yeah, for exhibitions, it was a slightly different picture, but sort of mostly with respect to progress. So, as I mentioned earlier, acquisitions, we saw pretty much no progress. And in exhibitions, you do see a real significant growth. Overall, it was 14% over the decade of exhibitions by women. But I'm actually going to check, because I do recall that there was quite an increase. So, closer to the present, you saw a lot more exhibitions compared to earlier. I believe that it doubled during the decade. And so that is a case where you can kind of see outward change happening. But the point that a lot of people that we spoke to made was that, exhibitions are cheaper than acquisitions. And they're important for scholarship, but they don't necessarily have the kind of permanent change. Like, they don't change an institution forever the way that an acquisition does. And so, a lot of people sort of cautioned us not to overestimate the importance of exhibitions, although of course they're important, but that they can often sort of obscure a lack of financial commitment when it comes to changing the collection.
I see. So, and I'm just curious, what do you happen to know? Who are some of these artists female artists who are getting the museum shows?
Yeah, it is. Well, so it's interesting because also the acquisitions and exhibitions were somewhat different. But in terms of exhibitions, which I think speaks a little bit more to kind of the popularity of the artist sort of in the zeitgeist and their sort of name recognition in a way. Yayoi Kusama was far and away the most popular. And I think she had about like 8 or 9 museum exhibitions during this period, which was the most. And then Louise Bourgeois and Shanique Smith, Kathy Opie, Kara Walker, Janet Cardiff, and Renika Dijkstra. So, it's an interesting mix, and notably, not all of these artists are living, but almost all of them are. And so I think it also speaks to, we're seeing more shows by contemporary artists also because, these are artists who work with very well-connected galleries, who have a presence already in, major private collections as well as public collections. In some cases, like Yuri Kusama, they have, a real track record for bringing in crowds, which is something that, museums do care about when they're planning an exhibition schedule. So you're not seeing like an unfamiliar name in terms of people who have repeat shows. Like, you're not seeing a Helma Afklint there, or a historic artist. I should actually look at the list. I'm not sure that there is a sort of non-contemporary artist on it. No, there isn't. So, that also kind of speaks to how museum shows, in addition to acquisitions, affect our understanding of history. Because you might go to a museum and see that, okay, there are female artists working today, but you don't necessarily get a sense in terms of solo shows of how individual female artists have influenced art history. We have certainly seen shows about, group shows that include women or group shows of female artists. I'm thinking about the Brooklyn Museum exhibition of both Radical Women, which was focused on Latin American artists, and We Want a Revolution, which was Black female artists. But, I think it's only really beginning that we're starting to look at, female old masters and think about how they fit in, or, impressionists, or beyond like the one or two, and one of the things that came up a lot in my conversations with people who have been looking into this issue for a long time is that it's not because those artists weren't there. And we're seeing that with the Prado in Spain this year, did their first or second show of a female artist ever. And, these are people who, now that we're looking into and learning their histories, were sort of really significant and in some cases really known in their time and respected in their time. But so I think, there is this, maybe there's starting to be a shift in our thinking from thinking of this as sort of revisionist history to like a kind of recovery of history. I hope that that's what happens.
Yeah, because I can imagine that, an argument you would hear a lot would be, well, it's unfortunate, but in history, tended to favor male artists, like the abstract expressionists those are the, we showed this certain group of male artists. So that's why the museums now show that work. That's what they have. That's what history taught us, even if, it was wrong or it didn't include everybody. That's what we have. So, that's why we have so many shows of male artists. But it sounds to me like you're saying, well, actually museums can go find in history the same.
Yeah, it might be what they have, but doesn't mean that's what happened. And that was really one of the things that was most interesting to me from this reporting process was I kind of felt that way going into it. Like, that the numbers would have to be really extreme to suggest inherent bias, like clearly, as opposed to, a mix of factors, including the fact that, women would be more likely to kind of abandon professional artistic work if they, in the face of lack of opportunity or raising a family. But so many people who really know this stuff, were saying like, no, that's just like a cop out that people use, that, almost at every moment in history, you can find women who are working. They just weren't necessarily written about. And the other thing that was became a very good sort of fact to have in my back pocket to use against people who would propose that is research that was done out of Yale University and the Yale School of Art, which is sort of the most elite art school in the US, that found that even after graduation rates reached parity from the school in the early 80s, that women artists and female graduates were written about in scholarly publications 2 to 3 times less frequently than their male peers. And so, that's just the 80s and onward. So that's the time we're living in now. And even when there were equal amounts of people, graduating into the artistic workforce, history was still writing it as if it was disproportionate. And so I think that's a really powerful argument for the fact that you can see from the get-go that people are being written out.
Yeah, definitely. Are there any institutions that you looked at that are doing either a particularly good or particularly bad job at sort of rectifying this history?
Yeah, I've got both.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think I would mention 2 in terms of people who are doing a good job, and that is the Philadelphia Academy or the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, rather, in Philadelphia, and DIA in New York, both of which acquired during this period more than 50% work by women, and we're the only 2 that did that. And in both cases, it was the result of really concerted effort internally, that may not have been projected publicly so much, but that was really clear when you looked at the annual counts. You know, we have this spreadsheet where we put in the numbers that we calculated from all the museums over time, and you can just see when you look at these, institutions lined up, like these institutions are consistently doing. It's not just like one year they acquired a bunch. And in the case of Pennsylvania, under their previous director in 2013, they sold a painting by Edward Hopper for around $40 million at Christie's. It was super controversial at the time because, the idea of selling, a prized work of art as a museum is always controversial. And, they said that they planned to sell it to acquire more art, that was more reflective of their time. And I remember when it happened at the time that there was all of this kind of like hand-wringing about, selling the past to gamble on an uncertain future, and you don't know how these people are important they're going to be, and like it's just, this was totally misguided. And what they didn't make clear, and I think probably wouldn't have been received well at the time, was that this was a really concerted effort to rebalance their collection and to use that money to acquire work by women and artists of color. And you can see that from 2013 on in their numbers, that it's just like, and they were kind of leaders in acquisitions in both of our studies, looking at African-American artists and looking at women, and at the same time period. So you can see that investment paying off. And I think it's really remarkable. And, there was a lot of talk even more recently last year as other museums started to do this. But I think they're kind of the untold originator of this strategy, whether you like the strategy or not. Mm-hmm. And then DIA is a really interesting example also because ever since its director, Jessica Morgan, joined in about 2016 or 17, I think, maybe earlier, 15, she has made a really concerted effort to kind of enrich and complicate the stories of the 60s and 70s as we understand them, and that, and as is DIA's, focus. And I think we associate that period and minimalism specifically with this kind of macho attitude. And, if you've been to DIA in upstate New York, these kind of muscular works. There's like an Agnes Martin, when especially when I used to go when I was younger, like there's an Agnes Martin room and there's just like John Chamberlain and like Richard Serra. And there's a real aesthetic that they have been, a proponent of. And she really went in there and started to complicate that, buying the work of artists of color like Sam Gilliam and so Black artists, and also Asian artists, Asian American artists, and of women. And so, there are artists that they have acquired major bodies of work from that I hadn't even heard of, which is embarrassing. And it is another really strong argument, I think, for this idea that, that there are kind of multiple drafts of history and there's no like one where you're done. So I think the work that both of those institutions are doing is really, really exciting and really interesting, both from kind of like a management standpoint and from an art historical standpoint. I would say in terms of institutions that are not doing great, that generally, obviously, encyclopedic museums are going to have a harder time because it is true that the further back you go in history, the fewer records there are. Graduation rates obviously were very different. Opportunity was different. I think there are people who are working, but they're certainly harder to find. And so, encyclopedic museums tended to have a lower numbers. So an institution like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston was, I think, 4 or 5% over the decade acquisitions of work by women. Which is low, considering our average was 11.
Yeah. It's also pretty low.
It's pretty low, yeah. But even, the other thing that was sort of scary was that even modern art museums had this problem, and they didn't really have the same excuse that MFA Boston could have. So, SF MoMA was, I think, 7%. And, that's also lower, and they're focusing on a modern and contemporary time period. And, I think in both cases, both institutions who we spoke to, they said, this is a reflection of, in a lot of cases, gifts that we've gotten. So it reflects the bias of our donors, which I think is true. And SF MoMA actually became one of those institutions that sold a work of art to fund the acquisition of works by women and artists of color. So they sold a Rothko, I think last year, for something in the order of, it was definitely over 20 million. And so we'll see what happens. But I think we always struggle in these stories between the kind of like naming and shaming and identifying the systemic problem, because it is true that the museums also, they put a lot of work into gathering this data and providing it to us and participating. And so we want them to keep doing that, and we want them to feel comfortable that they're contributing to kind of like an overall systemic change. But on the other hand, I do think that that institutions don't necessarily prioritize these things until they're pushed to, because it's just so easy to do the one thing and then think that you've done a lot more than that. I think we're all guilty of that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's really got to be, it's like you think, oh, times are changing, so we'll just naturally evolve too. Like women will be out there more, we'll just be collecting more, but it really is, I think what we learned is it is still very much a concerted effort you have to make constantly to look for artists of color, women artists, new. You have to always be looking at yourself and proactively going out there and looking, because the times aren't going to change you, even if there's protests or, things in the media, or, it's up to every institution to make these,
Yeah. And I think also, that making these changes doesn't just mean doing more, but it means doing things differently, especially now after institutions are coming out of a prolonged shutdown period. Budgets are really tight. Like, I am definitely aware that museums are going to be more reliant on gifts and donors than they would have if they had more money. And so, there is a danger to see a kind of pendulum swing back to a status quo even further. And I think the kind of like keeping a realistic idea and understanding that shifting representation means not only doing something, but also not doing something else. Mm-hmm. There's only so much money to go around. So if you're acquiring a work by a woman, in some cases, that means you're not acquiring the work by a man who's probably a great artist. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that is something that is a matter of priorities. And it's like too soon to tell whether we're going to see a broader shift in terms of institutional priorities.
Yeah. Well, are there anything else we didn't cover about the issues that we should touch on in the?
I would just quickly say in terms of the market that, we definitely saw a bigger shift, as I mentioned, but that in the same way that, museums have a kind of superstar effect where like the most popular people get a disproportionate amount of the exhibitions, you see that almost more so in the auction market. That I think the figures we had were the top 5 women sold at auction comprised 40% of the total auction sales. So all work by all women over the decade.
Which are who? Kusama.
The Kusama. You want to see if you can guess?
Oh boy, Kusama Bourgeois.
Yeah.
Cindy Sherman.
Mm-mm.
No. Jenny Saville.
No, although she does have the single most expensive work. It's Joan Mitchell, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Agnes Martin.
Okay. O'Keeffe, I should.
Yeah. So yeah, we have a kind of like a graph about this on, in the infographics page, but so you've got almost 41% are these top 5 women. And then all the other women in our data set, which is 1,663 women, make up the other almost 60%. So, you can see this idea that like, even as the numbers rise, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being spread out in any way equitably among female artists. And, we also surveyed gallery owners and specifically looking at the sort of mega galleries, and found that their representation of women I think maybe ranged from just under 20% to around 35% in terms of their rosters. And, pretty consistently also they said that women accounted for around a third of their total sales. So in some cases for galleries like Listen and I think David Werner, that was, women sort of punched above their weight in terms of the amount of sales they were bringing in for the percentage that they made up of the program, which is sort of interesting, but, it's still not near parity at all. So I think there's also this narrative that galleries are assigning more women to join the rosters, and, that we're almost there, but
the sales aren't coming up.
The sales aren't there yet, but also just the numbers in terms of ratio on big gallery rosters is not there. And the last thing I would just say is, because this is in the context of an art fair, that we, Art Basel has collected information on, the representation of women shown at the fair, due to its record keeping practices, what galleries bring, and it ends up being around 25% for all 3 fairs that they have: the Basel, Hong Kong, and Miami. But interestingly, actually, the one that has kind of like taken the lead and also shown the most upward progress is Hong Kong. That is where we're seeing a sort of more traction in terms of the representation of women in this very elite market context. And some people have said that maybe that's because there are more, self-made like female millionaires and billionaires in China, which is maybe true. I don't know. It's really hard to figure out the cause and effect of why. But it's an interesting thing. And I think it also just makes us realize that, not only are these shifts going to depend on kind of regional structures, obviously like the art school system in China and in Asia is very different from here. But that, it's also going to happen kind of at different times in different places. Like, it's not just going to be like all of a sudden, like everyone's changed. And even in the US, something that a shift that might be happening on the West Coast, it might not happen on the East Coast. And so it is the kind of thing that is collective, but also very individual.
That's fascinating. Super interesting.
All right. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Julia. That was fun.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.